All right, I think we can get this started. Welcome, and thank you everyone for attending this webinar and the opportunity to present our research to you today about scaling your cybersecurity threat modeling. As I said before, my name is Shane Parfit. I'm Senior Manager of Product Marketing and Marketing Services here at Security Compass. We're coming at you from Toronto, Ontario, Canada. Also on the line, we have Altaz Valani, our Director of Research for Security Compass. He will be our presenter for today, so thank you, Altaz. For this webinar, we will keep the audio lines muted, but feel free to type any questions into the chat and we'll try to address them as we go. We'll also open up the audio lines at the end of the presentation for questions. So for those of you who don't know much about us, I see some familiar names, but I just thought we'd do a quick kind of who we are and what we do, not a sales pitch. So Security Compass is a B2B company that is focused on application security. So what that means is we help other companies make their software secure. We do that mostly by focusing on building security during the development and deployment process. So we have two main offerings that are focused on this goal that you see here. So the company started out as a group of application security consultants, which is now known as our advisory group. And this group of folks performs a variety of verification services for a lot of large clients, such as like pen testing, red teaming, vulnerability assessments, general kind of offensive services. And all the other offerings we have were kind of born of that group and their observations with, working with large enterprises. So we also help organizations develop AppSec programs that work with Agile and DevOps methods. And we refer to this as DevSecOps solutions, which for us means streamlining and automating security activities, mostly in the development process, so that they can actually fit into a DevOps environment without slowing the whole thing down. At the nucleus of this solution is SD Elements. It's our policy to procedure platform for security and compliance. And we can also deliver just-in-time training, security training for developers through the integrations with SD Elements. And to round out the solution, we offer program planning, management services, implementation services, and can set up a security champions program for you as well. So that's a quick kind of who we are and what we do. Just a reminder that we will send a recording of this webinar to all those attending this webinar by the end of the week. And we hope you'll learn something from this. If you like this webinar or have any questions about the content, please don't hesitate to get in touch with us. You can reply to the reminder emails or just send an email to info@securitycompass.com. Also, if there's any content or webinars that you'd like to see from us, just please let us know and we'll definitely consider it. And with that, I'd like to hand it over to Altaz to get on with the actual planned content for the webinar. So take it away, Altaz.
Wonderful, great. Thanks a lot, Shane. Appreciate that introduction. Just a little bit about myself. Shane mentioned my name is Altaz, and I'm the Research Director at Security Compass. My role involves setting strategy and goals for our research team, which is really focused on secure application development, of which threat modeling is a key part. Previous to this, I was a Senior Research Director at Infotech Research Group, where I focused within the applications domain on the full software development lifecycle. We looked at cloud, agile, DevOps, and those types of initiatives. I'm also actively involved in the community, and I'm part of 3 IEEE working groups on DevOps, data privacy, non-functional sizing, and I'm also part of the technical leadership group over at SafeCode. I really enjoy research, collaboration, teaching, learning, and I'd invite you as we go through this presentation, please feel free to ask questions in the chat window. And even further to that, if you'd like to engage with us in a joint research initiative or some kind of collaboration, don't hesitate, reach out to me. I'd be delighted to explore opportunities for us to see if we can work further. So our presentation today is going to be broken up into 4 parts. First, we're going to do a deeper dive around threat modeling and examine its parts. And then what we're going to do is we're going to identify some specific activities that slow down the typical lifecycle process. We will then take a look at using the right building blocks. And then finally, we'll look at putting together these building blocks and making threat modeling work in today's environment where there is a real pressing need to move quickly. Much of what I'm going to present to you today comes from our own research experience in dealing with some of the biggest companies in the world, as well as our interactions with standards communities, regulatory bodies, academic research. We interact on all fronts. And our goal for today's presentation is to provide you with an alternative perspective on threat modeling. And I just want to be clear up front that we're not in this presentation trying to suggest that traditional threat modeling is no longer useful. What we're really trying to do here is exploring additional opportunities, additional ways and means of allowing us to conduct DevOps in a secure manner, in a way that still keeps the velocity of typical DevOps lifecycle chains intact. And so we're really trying to look at conducting the same level of rigor for every application, basically given the pressure that we have today on automation and speed and those types of things. So let's start off by looking at how pervasive threat modeling is in very large multi-billion-dollar companies. Here's some data that we collected in 2017, where we asked how extensive threat modeling was used as an activity within these large organizations. And what we found was that threat modeling, on average, isn't used that extensively. Now, the scale up at the top represents 1 being we don't perform this activity, all the way to 5 where we perform it on all the activities. And you'll see that threat modeling comes in at about 2.23. So what I'd like to do is take a deeper look at threat modeling and what we can do to improve this statistic. Now, I think before we go further, let's get a sense from the audience, Shane, on how difficult or how easy threat modeling is within their organizations. Is it possible to put up maybe like a quick optional poll, and let's share some of these results?
Yep, the poll is launched now, so if everyone wants to vote, it is kind of anonymous and we can share the results. We'll give you guys a few seconds to answer the poll, and this will be fun to just see what the results are for people on this call. All right, how about another 5 seconds to get your votes in? And 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, I'm gonna share the results.
Okay, so there we have it. I hope everyone is seeing the results. Most of us are neutral, followed by those that find it difficult. So I'd say it's looking like about almost, well over 80% are finding it neutral to hard. Very few of us find it easy. Now, I mean, clearly, this is a webinar on improving threat modeling, so we would expect to see results like this. And I think, just looking at the data that we've got here, I think you've come to the right place. Let's share our results with you. Let's talk about what we can do to improve things. And even those of you that find that threat modeling is relatively easy within your organizations, perhaps there's something that you can glean from the presentation today as well around alternative mechanisms to help you scale out as well. Thanks, Shane. Now, there are many different threat modeling approaches out there. Most often when we think of threat modeling, we think of Stride, but there are at least a dozen different threat modeling alternatives. So let's begin by taking a look and just seeing what are these various threat modeling approaches and what does that tell us? Each approach has its corresponding strengths and weaknesses. What we found is some of the modeling approaches are more formal and structured, while others are more intended to be collaborative and useful for brainstorming exercises, generation of attack vectors, ideas, ideation for improving security, those types of things. And some integrate very well with Agile and DevOps, and while others have a history that's really better suited for an isolated activity, and they tend to be used in conjunction with more kind of linear waterfall style processes and not as much iteration. We also need to consider the relative age of some of these approaches. Some of them are proven and have been in the industry for a very long time, while others are still emerging and being refined and being developed. Each of these approaches also focuses differently on the idea of separation of concerns. So some adequately distinguish between, for example, computational models and platform models. Others focus on the separation between platform independence and platform specific. So you'll get things in there that are really geared towards just one level of abstraction. Others go higher than that. For example, when we talk about risk, that goes all the way up to portfolio level discussions. We also have traceability. These approaches can focus on specific lifecycle stages like requirements or testing. And the skills required by each of these approaches is also quite different. Some approaches require very high level of skills and technical competency, those who understand security concepts, while others are intended to be used by non-technical professionals. So for example, if we look at, let's say, misuse cases, it's primarily an abstraction of functionality and how we might see users with all good intentions really using it in a way that's not appropriate and puts the system basically out of stability context. Also, when it comes to delivering on the output from these approaches, some of the reports can be highly technical in nature and require security expertise to interpret, while others are non-technical and tend to be an abstraction of the security concerns as we were talking about. So, some of these approaches inherently have a very deep security taxonomy, while others have a very shallow taxonomy, and they're really intended to create awareness rather than trying to identify specific security issues within an application. And finally, some of these approaches are better suited for offense and really using that kind of analysis and determining how an attacker might gain access to the system, while others are more defensive and intended to drive out activities within the build process to strengthen application security more proactively. Each of these threat modeling approaches are also really best suited for certain phases of the software development lifecycle. Now, we can certainly have dependencies across the lifecycle phases, but in general, a particular approach has its strength rooted either in generation of functional and non-functional requirements, or on design and architecture more at a high-level systems perspective, or during the coding phase with secure coding practices, or even during deployment to help manage packages, or within operations to determine effective ways of responding to threats. And finally, we also have auditing as a means of trying to determine a more accurate assessment of the security posture for our applications. This is not intended to suggest, again, that organizations utilize a single threat modeling approach across all phases. It is entirely possible for various teams to apply different threat modeling approaches based on what their specific needs are. We also found that each approach was created to achieve certain objectives and goals. It may be, for example, that the intent is to assess the security of a given architecture. And in doing so, a more rigorous approach that provides consistent results across teams tends to be more useful. Others are deployed to help achieve a set of security requirements. Some are intended to be used in a group setting to help surface diverse and wide-ranging perspectives. This can be quite useful in situations like DevOps, for example, where we've got different stakeholders. They need to come together initially to help drive out areas of focus. We also have levels of compliance to a framework. This is useful for the audit communities and risk officers to better understand any gaps from a compliance perspective. This would then feed into some kind of a risk register for the business to monitor. In some cases, the intent is to create an enhanced security mindset. Here we would be using threat modeling as an enabler to build a security culture, for example. Some of these approaches are intended to extract unwanted interaction within the system, as we described earlier. And overall, just in our own experience, the insider threat problem continues to remain a significant part of the threat to a system. Not that individuals are deliberately kind of trying to be malicious, but they may be using the system incorrectly, thereby putting the system in a vulnerable state. Some of these approaches help with determining the probability of exploitation. This can be useful for helping to identify return on investment and to focus on those areas that are critical to the business. And finally, some of these approaches help with the risk identification. A good example would be, for example, NIST RMF. Now, each approach also generates its own artifacts. Some of these approaches generate block diagrams, which are useful for systems architects and also to help assess systemic issues around security. Others create artifacts in the form of UML diagrams, which are more easily incorporated into development activities. Others focus specifically on use case or abuse cases. And here the intent is to focus on an abstraction of the application as it kind of relates to the actors of the system. Some of these approaches use cards, which are similar to UX type workflows to help understand intent of various users of the system. Some of these approaches generate an application process flow, which can help to understand what the critical flows are for an application and where potential areas of vulnerability might lie. This is different from the data flow diagrams, which we also have on this list. The emphasis for data flow diagrams is more on the flow of information across the application, whereas the application process flow is focused on the discrete application steps needed to execute a given business process. Moving on, some of these approaches create threat trees and attack graphs, which eventually can be kind of combined into an attack library. Others generate checklists, which can be useful for generating either some kind of a standard operating procedure or some kind of acceptance criteria. So all in all, we've got many different ways that the artifacts kind of get produced. Let's also think about the ideal state. Just kind of looking at this overall, we've examined various kinds of threat models, the output, the intent, the strengths and weaknesses. If we look at what we're trying to achieve across the SDLC, what we aspire for when we talk about threat modeling is seamless integration of threat modeling artifacts across the lifecycle. So what do we mean? Here we're talking specifically about artifacts that are well understood at each phase of the lifecycle. And the information contained therein doesn't deter from the overall process flow or with the work that's being done by individual teams. We would also like the threat model to be simple to generate. It should be scalable across high velocity environments with thousands of applications without requiring consistent use of a limited pool of resources, because that's not scalable. And finally, it needs to be easily understood. This means that across the lifecycle, if anybody were to look at the generated artifacts, it should be clear without requiring extensive knowledge of a particular domain. So essentially what we end up with here is we're looking for little to no friction at scale across the lifecycle. And when we talk about friction, what we mean here is the disruption that typically occurs when we're moving quickly, and then we have to generally slow down and then speed up again and then slow down. So it's not seamless. The velocity is impeded as a result of this slowing down and speeding up. So the question before us now is, can we achieve little to no friction at scale? And that's our fundamental question. So let's take a look at some common use cases based on popular threat modeling methods that are out there. And we're going to use these use cases to help drive out what we're seeing from a scalability perspective. So let's first of all examine traditional data flow diagrams. This, from our experience, tends to be the most popular approach that we've seen from our experience interacting with large companies. We start off with the requirements phase. And when we get into the data flow exercises, we often find that there are problems around artifact disparity. So what this means is architects are typically using block diagrams as abstractions of various systems and applications, but the data flow diagrams use a different paradigm for assessment. Sometimes there's a disconnect between the block diagrams and the data flow diagrams. Both artifacts therefore need to be updated synchronously, which can prove to be difficult for large and complex solutions. There's also the problem of the network effect. As our applications become more distributed with API calls being made across various components, each additional node contributes exponential growth in the number of paths that exist. Now, this can sometimes lead to paralysis, which goes against the need for speed. And finally, the output from data flow diagrams can differ depending on the skill level and the experience of various teams. So you'll end up with the output being different based on things like maturity, experience, team chemistry, and a bunch of external variables. Ideally, what we want is the ability to create consistent output across all these different teams. So the bottom line here is we end up with this friction in the design phase when we use a data flow-based threat modeling approach. Let's turn our attention to a second use case and talk about checklists. Once we get our requirements, what we find is we can generate a list of secure design-related items for downstream teams to focus on. So as a list, this would be based on historic experience, best practices, and so on. It offers a lightweight approach to generating the guidance, but the challenge that we see with checklists is this notion of exception policies. Certain instances of an application may, in fact, and justifiably, require non-conformance with certain parts of the list. There's also the problem of delta coverage when the list is updated. So how do we know that each application continues to conform to the latest version of our list? What we end up seeing is we just need better traceability. So once again, we end up with a situation where checklists can create friction. And that's really when we examine how checklists are used in context, versioning issues and just trying to look at amendments starts to kind of deter and get in the way. Let's go through one more example. And this time we'll take a look at misuse cases. After the requirements are complete, once again, the issue here is that our output from the requirements may be biased to be non-systemic. What we mean is because the focus is on use cases, it doesn't take into account that there may be alternative paths to compromise the system rather than through existing functionality that's provided by the application. There could also be an exaggeration of importance. Really what we're talking about here is certain misuse cases. Because we're focused on misuse cases for a given application, they could be mistakenly identified as being critical to the entire system. But if you look at it from the system's perspective, it is much less likely that some of these use cases or misuse cases would in fact occur. And so once again, what ends up happening is we end up with this friction because the information provided to downstream teams may require some extensive rework, particularly after security testing is completed in the testing phase. So what we've done is just try to examine the current challenges by using three very common techniques that are out there today. We looked at data flows, we looked at checklists, and we also looked at misuse cases. And we found that in every one of these situations, we've got some challenges that we need to address. So looking at these issues with the methods that we've described so far, we've got some reasonable evidence here that we need to think about our threat modeling approach in a way that maybe broadens the scope or allows us to think about threat modeling a little bit differently. So taking a step back, what we really want is to conduct threat modeling in a way that minimizes the network effect, so scaling issue. It provides consistent output, helps to manage exception policies, provides the latest coverage from a security perspective, and is systemic. It also should provide a realistic assessment of the importance, not just from a micro perspective within an application, but also across the entire solution. And finally, it helps us to reduce artifact disparity across the lifecycle. This is really what we're looking for when we talk about the ideal threat modeling scenario. Now, the way that we achieve this is we want to generate a scalable process that is going to work across many different systems, so it will scale, and ideally utilizes a common artifact. Now, again, this is not to suggest that we want a single monolithic document across the entire software lifecycle. Really what we're talking about here is we want to construct artifacts intelligently so that we can easily translate these artifacts into domain-specific artifacts as needed. And so there's a translation that can occur much more readily back and forth. So given our intent, what we need to focus on is really sort of the three different areas. We want to focus on the people and the processes. We want to focus on systems, and we want to focus on data. Specifically, what we want to take a look at is we will examine the people in the process to provide us with the scalability that's needed. We will use system abstractions so that we can more effectively manage threat modeling across many systems, and data sharing around delivery of a common artifact across the lifecycle. So what we're going to do now is take a closer look at each one of these, and we're going to start with data sharing, and then we'll talk about system abstraction, and we'll bring it all together on the people and process side. So dealing with data sharing, first of all, we're all aware that data sharing today already exists. If we look at it from a security context, we have a number of lists that are provided by some very intelligent and credible teams out there. What we're showing you here is just an example of how all these lists can help to provide security within your organization context. So for example, many organizations utilize common weakness enumeration, which is in fact based on information from other lists. Similarly, we have regulations that are based on frameworks provided by NIST. We also have standards that utilize common weakness enumeration and regulations along with harmonization of these existing standards. Now, all of these together can help organizations provide a better security context. I think, why don't we take a poll at this point? Shane, can you just kind of put up a poll and let's find out how many of you currently use some of these industry standards, NIST or ISO, IEEE, MITRE, something similar to help you inform your security policies. Okay, we'll just give it another few seconds here. Okay, I think, Shane, if we can just close off the poll. Okay, so overwhelmingly, what we found is most of us do use industry frameworks. So I think this, because of the lists that exist out there, rather than trying to do this on our own, we should be able to inject some of these standards and regulations and frameworks into our threat modeling initiatives. And in fact, when we are having conversations with standards bodies of which we're involved, as well as with regulators, what we're finding is in many cases, a lot of these frameworks and regulations and standards are becoming more and more technical, and they're incorporating a lot of these frameworks in them. So there's a sense where some of the work that we are doing internally could be offloaded to some of these other teams as they go in and they construct some of these standards. And that's really what we're trying to get at here is that, this whole data sharing perspective already exists out there. Speaking of taxonomies and sort of application abstractions, we also know that application taxonomies exist for applications used within organizations. So just an example, we have many custom or off-the-shelf applications represented in sort of abstract platform independent manners. Here, we're not talking specifically about an instance of an application type, but rather looking at generic categories of applications. This could be quite useful for initial assessments of cost, risk, impact to the enterprise architecture even. And what we do is we instantiate these applications into this platform-specific domain. Now, from a threat modeling perspective, specific domains can change quite frequently. Really, when we look at it from a platform-specific perspective, and that puts a lot of pressure on trying to kind of go through these threat modeling activities each time if they take too long to execute. So the issue here is if we conduct threat analysis using common patterns at a higher level of abstraction, and then as we instantiate our platform-specific instances, what we'll find is a lot of the abstract notions get carried through into the various instances. And so by doing that, we essentially are able to create policies based on specific kinds of applications. And that can help to accelerate some of our threat modeling. Okay, so there was a question, Shane is just telling me just an opinion on OWASP and its inclusion here. Yeah, so if we look at some of the frameworks that are out there, we do find that OWASP, for example, puts out a top 10 list regularly, and that is often used in a lot of the standards and the frameworks, at least in the initial discussions, to talk about how we might be able to construct more secure standards. So for sure, I mean, I think, I hope the intent of the question, and I'm interpreting this correctly, is, what's the, do we see OWASP being used within the sort of the standards creation process, and what is our notion as far as our perspective on how OWASP is playing a role in some of these standards creations out there. If I missed your question, please do ask again, but I hope that answers your question. Okay. Now, when it comes to creating a process, really this is that sort of third leg that we're talking about. This process that we're talking about is achieved by taking a look at what we had discussed previously. So we talked about the various regulations and frameworks, and we also talked about application archetypes. Now, if we merge these together and create a matrix, what we have now is, for example, on the left-hand side, all of these frameworks and audit practices, and on the bottom we have these application archetypes, which may be legacy applications or greenfield applications. And at the intersection of these two domains, we end up with the ability to determine what we need to focus on for each application, as well as the coverage or the risk against a given framework or practice. So in essence, this becomes like a lightweight threat modeling approach. It utilizes many of the common scenarios that exist out there in the industry already. And it also, from a network effect perspective, it minimizes that effect because it reduces the scope out of the gate. What it does is it provides a more kind of holistic and consistent output, really in the form of lists that can be readily understood and translated into these downstream domains as needed. So we'll often hear conversations around, we've got these policies that we've created. How do these policies then get translated into procedures that our dev teams need to execute on? This is exactly what we're describing here. We drive out, based on the intersection of these two areas, these two domains, what the policies are and how they map to procedures. And what we also find is we have few exception policies, and those that do come up can be injected as part of the audit practice, and it really helps you now create a more standardized map. What this approach does is also it provides the latest coverage for issues based on well-known industry lists. It is systemic in nature, and we have to necessarily do that. I'm a part of some groups at the IEEE, and I'm well aware that we have to consider many different kinds of use cases in organizations. And finally, this approach is realistic. What I mean by that is these activities really are those that need to be conducted to help the business rather than a perceived importance just from a technical perspective. Now, I just want to be clear, this is not a silver bullet. One area where this approach may not be well suited is in trying to create that one common artifact that can be used across the life cycle. So we described earlier how it's possible to add some addendums or to add some additional changes so that you can help drive out what additional policies and procedures would end up being. Having said that, because the output is generated in the form of a list, we can perform translation between these lists and the various lifecycle domains. So for example, a list that's generated from, let's say, NIST 800-53 can be translated into discrete activities for developers, such as managing SQL injection. And so now you can start to see the correlation that comes about between NIST and what OWASP is working on, for example. And things that we would have caught in our traditional threat modeling approaches are already built into this now. And you can further augment this with just-in-time training if you want. And sort of this repetitive nature of the exercises, if you're looking at just-in-time training, helps to reinforce the security practices and to build this whole culture of security. And so what we do is, if you examine this approach, we are essentially using threat modeling as a core activity to helping you build a security culture. And as these activities are being conducted, there's an inherent tie-in with traceable risk for the business. And we found in our research that this was one area that was very difficult using traditional threat modeling approaches. How do you tie in those activities and the output from those activities directly back to traceable risk for the business? And oftentimes it comes back to conclusions like, if we don't do this, then here's the likelihood or the potential impact of what that might mean. And it's very difficult, we found, to justify that kind of approach to obtain the necessary time and the funding to kind of make that happen. Whereas if we take this approach that's based on standards and compliance, though we have the same underlying notion, what we do is we approach risk from the perspective of things like compliance, or based on things like resiliency, these kinds of business level policies. And not only that, but we can easily generate audit reports and also examine our application posture at any point in time. And that moves and kind of gets injected into a risk register. This risk register, which is typically managed by some kind of a risk council, then assesses how these threat modeling activities can support, as we talked about earlier, better resiliency or better compliance or some kind of operational activities. And these risk items can then be fully traceable because of this interaction between the frameworks and the application archetypes and the intersections driving out the procedures. The traceability goes right back to the threat modeling activities, and it can really be a powerful way of talking about budget and risk in a way that's highly relevant to the business.
Just a quick question. How does this approach minimize the network effect?
Yeah, so the question is, how does this minimize the network effect? The network effect really essentially is about having multiple components in an application. And so the traditional threat modeling approach tries to look at all of the different paths and trying to determine from those which ones are false positives and what can we now do to try and focus on just those areas that are essential. The net effect of that kind of an activity is to drive out those procedures that our development teams need to focus on. By taking this approach, rather than looking at it just from a threat modeling approach where we've got data flows, for example, out of the gate, we already have a baseline set of procedures. Because these are industry best practices that have security notions built into them, we don't need to go through that extensive threat modeling exercise. And so what ends up happening now is we drive out these procedures out of the gate. Now, again, we're not suggesting that this is a replacement for every threat modeling activity. If something is mission critical, then we still advocate that you do need to go and take a look and see if there may be some other cases where you want to consider potential attack vectors. But there are several use cases where that level of rigor and that level of analysis is going to slow you down. And you're better off using common best practices that already exist within frameworks and regulations to help drive out some of this. And that's really where this scalability issue comes in. And every time you run it, any new type of application you come out with, because it's based on application archetypes, as you instantiate a specific application type, it immediately pulls down and tells you that for this application type, because it is based on an instance of one or more application archetypes, these are all the things that you need to focus on. And that really gives you now a sense of how you can manage your resources and your risk accordingly to have a more intelligent discussion with the business. So I hope that that addresses the question that you had. And I think, just kind of bringing this to the end here, I think it's always important when we posit a particular approach that we need to validate whether this is, in fact feasible. What we've presented to you here has in fact been validated in our work with some of the biggest global companies. It also aligns well with DevOps and the priorities for continual security, continual risk management, continual compliance. And it has a natural feedback loop from audit and operations through the mapping model that we explained here right into your software development lifecycle. So essentially, threat modeling is now a shared activity. It doesn't belong just with the developers or with your security professionals. It's a shared activity that also includes auditors now. And yet at the same time, it also still allows us to use traditional threat modeling approaches where needed. So once again, I just want to come back to this. This is something where we're looking at, really augmenting what we are doing today from a threat modeling perspective. And the focus here, the specific problem that we are trying to address is how can we create threat modeling that's scalable for a DevOps context? So how do we manage this cybersecurity risk without actually slowing us down, which is essentially slowing the business down? Now, this investment in SDLC activities and SDLC tools, we sometimes get the question, does this do away with that? And the answer to that is it does not, actually. It supports all of the existing investments. What we're describing here, sits at a layer above the SDLC, really where you've got your coordination and your program level activities taking place. And because threat modeling is an early stage activity, the results from that activity can be integrated into your downstream development, testing, and deployment activities. And it also, at the same time, provides business stakeholders with traceable information around risk exposure. So I think at this point, what I'd like to suggest is let's just take any questions, and Shane, I'll hand it over to you, and we can basically ask any questions.
Oh, great. So that brings us to the end of the presentation. Thank you very much for patiently listening to what our research is showing us. Before I get to the questions, I'll launch a quick poll. It's optional. If you were interested to know in any type of information you'd like to receive from us. So, if you like, you can answer that. And I will open it up for questions now. I don't actually think I can open up the audio lines, but we will take some questions over the Q&A feature of Zoom here. And I do see a few questions already. The first was related to, the first question we had during the presentation about, how OWASP figures into it, and just a little bit further clarification about how that, actually compares to NIST, for example, and if they're kind of seen as equal footing in these, feeding information into threat modeling.
Yeah, for sure. We do see a lot of these organizations are working together, and looking at it from a research perspective, we're all sharing this data. We're looking for better ways to do things. We reach out to practitioners in the industry, which is why at the start of this webinar today, I opened it up. If any of you want to discuss further with us, if you want to participate in some of our research activities, if you want to collaborate, please reach out. We're all trying to do our part to help the security community here.
Okay, great. Next question. How does a fast-paced agile tech company start doing threat modeling without impacting its dev flow?
Yeah, this is a really important question. So this was part of the disruption notion that we talked about earlier in this webinar. If you're a fast-paced agile tech company, um, slowing down and trying to conduct threat modeling isn't a feasible option. So we've discussed this and we've seen some of the research that's out there, and some teams have advocated, well, let's just focus on the requirements that we have and conduct threat modeling around just those requirements. Unfortunately, if you take that kind of an approach, you may end up missing some of these systemic issues that are out there. So a much better approach is to use some of the frameworks that are already out there, plug that into your agile and DevOps lifecycle and your sort of your process that you've got, filter out based on the application type those policies that are not going to be relevant. And this is really when you start to look at application archetypes and how those archetypes map to the policies, and help drive that through to your development teams. So as far as your development teams are concerned, they're not looking at policies. What they're looking at are things like ensure that you're addressing SQL injection. But through the mapping, that SQL injection gets mapped to NIST 800-53. And so you know that you've got a set of best practices that you are following, and you've already done the mapping that now talks about how you can instantiate that policy downwards to your dev teams. So this is how you make this work. You don't go back and you don't throw a set of policies to your dev teams. It creates a lot of confusion. You keep the dev teams using the same workflow that they're using. And what you do, let's say you're using Jira, for example. In Jira, you will have an incident in there that is coming directly from the mapping that you've done that says these are the requirements for what we need to take a look at. And then at a higher level, when you aggregate all this data, that mapping goes back towards how much coverage do we have against each of these existing standards. So that's the approach that you would take. And it was interesting, that was one of the points where we were trying to figure out a better way of trying to address the business need on the one hand, so we're not doing threat modeling and the business feels that there's very little benefit from it. But the other side of it, looking at it from the bottom up, it's how do we do this in a way that doesn't slow down our dev workflows and our dev teams.
All right, thanks. Another question from the line. How many archetypes are there? Also, some seem to be language-based and some domain-based. Is one typically choosing multiple archetypes to describe their system?
Yeah, so what we usually do when we take a look at archetypes, this gets a little bit into domain modeling and ontologies. You're right, there is an interpretation here. What may be a set of archetypes for one organization may be different from what another, some other organization might want to use, and this is contextual. However, there is a common base. For example, Java applications, web applications, Android mobile applications, iOS mobile applications. These are all generic types that are out there, and there are certain best practices that we can use. Let's say in the case of web applications, we know that we need to take a look at the potential for cross-site scripting. We need to take a look at SQL injection. We need to ensure we've got secure endpoints, things like that. So that's, when we look at application archetypes, there are about 10 or so application archetypes that we generally find consistently coming out. It is not something that's static. It is dynamic, especially when we start to take a look at the IoT landscape, as we see some sort of emerging architecture types that are sort of coming out from that space. So what I would suggest, our approach, and what we're seeing in conversing with our customers, is use your application archetypes based on where you are, as you refine your policy to procedures, you're going to find that that's good enough, or you may need to create or instantiate another application archetype. And there's nothing wrong with that. You simply create it and you follow the same process again. The main issue is try and approach it from an archetype perspective. Don't try to do it on a per application specific kind of instance, because there's too much volatility in that, and you want to kind of take a step back and create a more abstract interface. So I hope that that answers your question.
Okay, kind of a segue from that, or for a specific archetype, there's a question. Can you comment on how this approach can be applied to microservices? It seems like this approach could minimize the network effect, and it is rapid enough that you could feasibly perform the modeling activity across many tiny applications / services.
Yeah, this is a really interesting point. With microservices, disruptive as they are to organizations, essentially every microservice has its own life cycle. And you've got different API endpoints. Each team is responsible for one or more of these microservices. Trying to go in and look at managing all of the various paths across these microservices can just bring you right down. There are so many different ways that these services could interact with each other. And I think what we need to do is, when we take a step back and look at the intent of microservices, usually you have microservices that are that have data that traverses over some kind of a secure HTTP protocol, and you've got to ensure that you've got a secure endpoint. These can make use of existing application archetypes, as we had discussed previously. Even though you don't have an actual web front end, you could still have a payload that you need to take a look at, and so you might need to scrub it, for example. These are all practices that can come in as a result of using some of these frameworks. So you don't have to go and redo a lot of this kind of work, this threat modeling, this testing. Out of the gate, you inform your teams that this will be injected into their development streams, and each team, as they're moving forward with their own respective life cycles for each microservice, what we now see is they are already adhering to that particular standard that you've created. And if it's not the case, then because of the integration that exists with the software development lifecycle, you will then be able to come back and say, well, based on NIST 800-53, for example, we know that this particular microservice doesn't conform to this policy. And if we drill down a little bit deeper, we'll find out where that gap exists. So it very quickly allows you now to go really to a level where you're able to go back and forth between the policies and the development procedures that these teams execute upon in a way that is scalable. So you're not redoing and repeating a lot of this sort of threat modeling activity again and again and again.
Great. I think we have time for one more question. So the question is there any threat modeling approach that would be best suited for a software development organization?
Yeah, so we have spoken to very large software development organizations, and what we've found is they are also taking a very similar approach to what we are suggesting. Looking at standards, looking at short bursts of lists that can get injected into the software development lifecycle helps them to move quickly. It also removes the burden of trying to get your security and risk teams having to understand code, and at the same time having your development teams trying to understand policies. So from that perspective, my recommendation would be to start with some of the common frameworks that are out there, like for example, let's say NIST 853. You could look at ISO 27001, though 27034 is probably a better standard that's got some elements of it that have already been released. And I would also, if you're looking at a more comprehensive framework, as we talked about earlier, you might want to take a look at the cybersecurity framework, for example. And what you want to do is, to get started, take a look at these standards, look at the clauses, develop actionable procedures against the clause. Don't do it against an entire standard. That's too vague, and it's not going to give you the fidelity that you're looking for. Do it against a clause to those that are relevant for your organization. And because you've now got this mapping from the policy to the procedure, you now need to overlay that with which of our application archetypes should this policy to procedure apply to. And now that you've got that in place, keep reusing that again and again. And that's the approach that we've seen being used.
All right, we actually have one more good question. Even though we're running out of time, I think we should address it. I can cancel my outro speech if needed. No one cares anyways, probably. So the question is there any facility in your product line that allows rating and prioritization of systems or the processes that compose them? This would be in an effort to threat model more critical systems and dispense with threat modeling with lower risk systems.
Yeah, so this is more of a product question. But yes, it is possible to go in there and set a priority level. So for a given application archetype, within a given phase, for a given standard, and this is essentially, so when we define risk, we don't define it as sort of a nebulous notion. We go in there and we have, I believe it's a 4-tuple, 4 different variables that go into contributing towards risk. So if you want to find out more from a product standpoint, I would invite you, please do reach out. We do have prioritization mechanisms in there. And I want to be careful that you know, it doesn't become kind of a sales pitch or anything like that. So, you know, with your permission, I'd like to ask if you could just reach out to us. I would be more than happy to have an offline conversation with you on that.
Okay, great. Thanks, Altaz. That was great. Thanks for the presentation and answering all the questions. I always enjoy hearing your perspective on these concepts. So just before we close off the webinar, we'd like to let you all know we'll be attending AppSec USA in San Jose in just a couple of weeks, I think October 8th to 13th. So if you're attending the show, just please drop by. We'd like to see you. And I think at this point we can end this webinar. Another reminder that we'll send out the recording and the slide deck to you all by the end of the week, and we'll follow up with any questions or comments we receive between now and then. Again, please don't hesitate to contact us about anything. Also, let us know if there's anything you'd like to see from us in the way of webinars or other content. You can reply to the webinar invite emails, or you can email to info@securitycompass.com. Thanks again to everyone for attending this webinar, and we hope you have an excellent rest of your day.